So last we left off, I was talking about loss of brain matter, changes in the brain's anatomy, and also the impacts certain neuroleptic and stimulant drugs and some SSRIs have on, well, kids going through puberty and how it may stunt their growth. So we're going to go ahead and pick up right where I left off, the priming of addiction and the sensitization loop. This is based off of the dopamine hypersensitivity hypothesis. I'll probably we're just going to get into it here because obviously it's much better than me just trying to explain to you that essentially we're priming children to accept more dopamine than they are actually capable, or they are actually naturally predisposed to doing. So, get started off. A central clinical justification for prodromal treatments, aka prior to, of conditions like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, behavioral dysregulation, and mood instability is a theory that early medication stabilizes the brain and prevents subsequent substance use disorder. However, comprehensive neurobiological evidence regarding the kindling effect and dopamine supersensitivity suggests the exact opposite. Early sustained exposure to exogenous neuroregulators structurally primes the pediatric brain for lifelong addiction and severe intractable psychosis or mood instability, really depending on what kind of drugs they're being given. Now, geez, it's been a long time since I've read about the kindling kindling effect. It's essentially, you know what, I'm not going to try. I should probably look that up prior, right? But let's go ahead and just power through this because there's a lot to go through. And dopamine supersensitivity, psychosis, DSP, and D2 high state. The continuous administration of antipsychotic medication inevitably loses its therapeutic efficacy over time to an adaptive evolutionary physiological response known as an iatrogenic dopamine supersensitivity. So, in a nutshell, you know how with illicit drugs your brain adapts to it and you gain a tolerance? Well, psychotropic drugs are really no different. The only difference is the difference that your clinician tells you is different. Also, the dependency thing, but you know what? I'm going to go ahead and just challenge that because there seems to be a social construct around these drugs that prevents them from being criticized in any way whatsoever. The brain, detecting a chronic, unnatural blockade of its D2, remember dopamine, receptors, attempts to restore homeostatic signaling through two primary mechanisms: the absolute upregulation, increased density, aka your brain is literally creating more receptors because dopamine stays blocked, of D2 receptors in the striatum, and the transition of these receptors into enhanced affinity state, commonly referred to as the D2 high state. Independent researchers such as the British psychiatrist Joanna Moncrieff, whose name is, well, let's just say in psychiatry she's being trashed at the moment because she broke their favorite toy, the monoamine hypothesis, have extensively documented how this compensatory upregulation forms the foundational neurobiology for dopamine supersensitivity psychosis, rebound psychosis, and persistent post-withdrawal supersensitivity psychosis. When an adolescent is preemptively placed on antipsychotic for prodromal symptoms, their brain is forced to become violently hypersensitive to endogenous dopamine, aka dopamine that comes from outside of the body. Consequently, any reduction in dose, missed dose, or naturally occurring stressful event triggers a massive overreaction of the mesolimbic pathway. This breakthrough psychosis is frequently and tragically misinterpreted by clinicians as natural progression or worsening of the underlying disease rather than severe drug withdrawal hazard. Which, yeah, I mean, that'd be one way of putting it, gaining a tolerance, and then all of a sudden your drugs stop working. I'm sure many of you have encountered that. And then they have to up the dose to increase the efficacy, but it doesn't matter how much they up the dose, eventually it's going to exhaust itself, so you have to switch the type of drug that you're currently on to try to mitigate that effect, but eventually your brain just kind of adapts to all of it and poops out. Which, that's the name of it, is the poop out effect. I'm not making that up, that's literally what that's called. This misinterpretation prompts clinicians to increase the dosage, driving patients deeper into the supersensitivity loop, creating a biological dependency on the molecule. Long-term use essentially manufactures a severe biological vulnerability that did not previously exist, transforming transient childhood distress or mild prodromal abnormalities into anomalies, not abnormalities, well, it's whatever, into chronic treatment-resistant psychosis, the kindling effect, and long-term SUD transitions. Similar destructive mechanisms operate in children treated longitudinally with stimulants. The kindling effect describes how repeated low-dose exposure to psychostimulants induces a progressive, permanent sensitization of the central nervous system. Essentially, it makes you more prone to being more sensitive to dopamine hits. Animal models and human clinical observation reveal that the sustained amphetamine-induced hyperactivity of the dopaminergic system is sufficient to induce a psychotic state in otherwise healthy individuals. This neuroadaptation increases the excitability of limbic nuclei, permanently alters the reward circuitry, and strips the prefrontal cortex of its buffering capacity. Essentially, it makes you much more capable of developing an addiction because, well, they say that you have a disorder that makes you develop addictions. Nice. While early stimulant treatment may temporarily mask behavioral symptoms in the classroom, the long-term epidemiological data regarding SUD transition remains highly concerning. Naturalistic longitudinal studies following children with ADHD into adulthood have produced mixed results, with some industry-aligned literature suggesting protective effects, but robust national register data demonstrating severe risk-conferring associations. Well, isn't that weird? The people selling the drugs are telling you that it protects you, but everybody else is telling you it don't. The underlying neurobiology cleanly explains this phenomenon. Protracted exposure to prescription stimulants downregulates endogenous dopamine production while simultaneously sensitizing the receptors. Upon cessation or during interdose withdrawal, the adolescent is left in a state of substantive dopamine deficit. This chronic anhedonia and physiological deficit generates an intense biological craving for exogenous neuroregulation. In my case, it was sugar. The supersensitivity developed during early life means that if an adolescent later experiments with illicit substances such as opioids or methamphetamines, their presensitized brain responds with uniquely reinforced hypersensitivity. And it's funny that we don't talk about this and we barely research it. There's more than enough evidence out there to suggest it's a problem. Let's deal with it. And by deal with it, I mean, why don't we look at how we're prescribing drugs? I'm pretty sure that everybody can make a lot more money if we just kind of take a few steps back and look at the whole picture. I don't know why I'm whispering. By continuously flooding the pediatric synapses with amphetamines and methylphenidate, the psychiatric establishment effectively preconditions the reward circuitry to require chemical intervention for baseline functioning. This developmental sabotage paves the way for skyrocketing rates of adult polysubstance abuse and dependency, ensuring the child never develops the endogenous neurochemical resilience required to navigate adult life. And here's the nice little chart. Ain't that nice? I can just take a moment to read it. I'm not going to read it for you. And notice the tiny little numbers off to the side. Well, we're going to get to those later. All right. Moving on to a very, very sad topic. One that I literally cannot speak of or show you at all because censorship sucks. The and disability paradox. If preemptive psychiatric interventions were genuinely protective in disease-modifying longitudinal markers of societal health, such as functional independence, workforce participation, reduction, oh man, I'll tell you, I think I'm coming down with a cold, would show dramatic improvements over the last 40 years. Instead, independent researchers like Robert Whittaker, Peter Ghosh, and Robert Healy have exposed a glaring paradox. As the preemptive drugging of children has exponentially increased, the rates of lifelong psychiatric disability and have simultaneously exploded. Alright. Let's just hope I didn't miss any. Whitaker's exhaustive analysis of historical and modern epidemiological data rigorously details the anatomy of an epidemic, tracks the trajectory of mental illness disability in the United States over the last half-century. In 1955, prior to the widespread introduction of psychopharmacology, the psychiatric disability rate stood at approximately 1 in 468 adults. By 1987, the year Prozac was introduced, ushering in the modern era of chemical imbalance theory and mass prescribing, the number of adults on supplemental security income or Social Security disability insurance due to mental illness was 1.25 million. Today, that number has surpassed 4 million. The pediatric data is even more condemning. I'm not going to say that word. The number of children and youth on SSRI on SSI due to severe mental illness skyrocketed roughly 16,200 from 16,200 in 1987 to over 600,000 in the modern era, a staggering increase that directly tracks with the rise of pediatric psychopharmacology. In a pre-drug era, affective disorders such as depression and bipolar illness were predominantly episodic, with extreme rates of spontaneous remission and good long-term functional outcomes. Today, individuals treated with longitudinal psychopharmacology experience a chronic, unremitting course marked by continuous relapse, not contentious. When comparing total years of functional independence, unmedicated cohorts consistently and dramatically outperform their medicated peers. The World Health Organization screening studies for depression consistently report that unmedicated groups experience significantly higher recovery rates, where continuing depression is highest among those treated long-term with antidepressants. Not at all shocking. The premature transition of a labeled child onto SSDI signifies a total systemic failure. It represents a clinical conversion of a temporary developmental hurdle into a permanent iatrogenic disability identity. Big on identity there, because it seems like right now ASD is being treated as an identity rather than a disorder. It's being sold that way, actually, and it's starting to really bother me. The criteria for SSDI explicitly require evidence of functioning limitations and prolonged therapeutic interventions, effectively rewarding the chronicity of that the drugs themselves create. So, just to kind of break it down for you, and this is just for those people out there in the crowd who are like, the government shouldn't be paying for people's health care. They shouldn't be paying for all this stuff. These people are the parasites. Who are the real parasites? Are they the people who've been forced to take these drugs, or are they the people who are shoveling out the drugs so they can pad their pockets with all kinds of money? I mean, come on, guys. You can't blame these people forever. Well, actually, yeah, you can. The only thing you're going to do is take out a shovel and bury them. Is that what you're all thinking? Or can we just all agree here that if we were to stop all of these drugs, including the first generation antipsychotics that are currently being pushed out right now as being miracle drugs, maybe we'd see higher recovery rates? But no. That would require too much work and change, and that some of us would have to swallow our pride. Anyways, here's a nice little chart for you. I'm sure you've had time to read this part right up here, so we're just going to go ahead and move down here. I'm going to let you go ahead and look at those numbers again. Just look at them. Look at the number of people who are being put on disability so that they are dependent on this system because they are given drugs as children. It's okay, I'll wait. I'm going to take a nice little drink here. Kind of let you stew on that one for a while. Did it sink in? You ready to swallow that pride? Spit out that pill? And maybe take a much more nuanced perspective on how we should move forward as an industry? And by we, I mean you, because you've pretty much kicked me out. Are you done? Well, obviously not. So we're going to go ahead and go to this heavily redacted region of the paper, because apparently we can't talk about certain subjects on YouTube. The black box and long-term completion rate. The ultimate catastrophic outcome of the pre-dromal intervention paradigm is the violent exacerbation of T. Despite the ostensible goal of prevention, the long-term rates following the initiation of psychiatric treatment remain horrifyingly high. Long-term studies indicate that 4% to 10% of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia die by... Man. Ugh, must be all that vaping I'm doing. For those diagnosed with bipolar disorder, completion rates are even higher, reaching 10 to 15%. The independent pharmacologists and researchers, preferably Peter Ghosh, have highlighted that forced psychiatric treatment, particularly the administration of neuroleptics and SSRIs, significantly increases the risk of in children and adolescents. The mechanism of action for increased mortality is rooted directly in severe adverse effects of drugs themselves, specifically drug-induced akathisia, an extreme state, a state of extreme, unbearable inner restlessness, pacing, and physical agitation. Profound emotional blunting, the psychological despair induced by chronic physical deterioration and dysfunction. The FDA black box warnings mandated for antidepressants regarding pediatric ITI for emotional regulation and instilling a sense of hopeless chronicity. Preemptive drugging creates the exact psychological and physiological conditions necessary to drive children to completion. Furthermore, the longitudinal 10-year tracking of ideation and completion reveals that the prior history of attempts, often exacerbated during the initial titration phases of psychotropics. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that when you're coming off your drugs, you might just have a really severe rebound? Who'd have thunk it? Is the most robust predictor of eventual completed... I think I'm done with this section. The paradox is unassailable. The pharmacological tools deployed by the state to prevent death and disability are the primary biological vectors driving both. I am not making this up at this point. This is like some serious, like, next level dark stuff. Oh man, I'm not sure if I want to get into polygenics after that one. I think I need to go have more water. Just, a little glass of water to kind of deal with it in my chest.